So in our house, we have this floor lamp nestled away in the corner of our kitchen slash dining room. Now both me and my partner like this lamp because it's a little bit different and it gives off a nice ambiance in the evenings. However, we find it's just a little bit too low to the ground, so I've been tasked with making some kind of stand slash side table to raise it up off the ground by about 25 centimetres. Now it does need to check a couple of boxes. It needs to fit in the space without getting in the way of the eating table when we have people round. It also needs to fit the aesthetic of downstairs, which does have somewhat of a cottage slash farmhouse feel, and yes, you can probably tell, we like dogs, especially my partner. It also needs to be cheap, more specifically cheaper than it would cost to buy one. And I also seem to have accumulated a lot of poplar over the last year, which desperately needs using. I haven't done a build similar to this in a long time, so I figured I'd do plenty of planning to reduce the risk of me making a mistake, which, let's face it, is highly likely. I created 3D designs on SketchUp to work out the cut list, and more importantly, the angles of all the joining pieces. Some people are planners and some people aren't. When it comes to designing things, I most definitely am a planner. Despite poplar being such a cheap hardwood and me having so much of it, I didn't want to waste any. So I decided it was best to use up some of my 6mm MDF offcuts to make a rough mock-up of the build, so when I actually came to making it, everything in theory would go as smooth as possible. I started off cutting all of the 6mm MDF roughly down to size so that I could then follow up cutting it into its final dimensions. As cutting thin strips on the table saw is definitely pretty sketchy. Once I've cut down all the MDF parts to the correct width, I can use my angle finder to find the angle that I'll need to set up the mitre gauge on the table saw. When working with angles that are very close to 90 degrees, it's always a good idea to reference which way the angle cuts need to be made, just to stop any mishaps from occurring, or maybe that's just me. So I like to mark them out on the pieces of material that I'm using. I started to build my MDF mock-up by cutting the angle needed at one end of every single piece. I did this so that I could then measure off of the tip of this angle to determine the length that the uprights needed to be. Cutting the uprights was long-winded and repetitive, as I had to gradually sneak up on my mark line, removing a little bit more material with each pass, being careful not to take off too much, as that would really ruin my day. Once I had the length locked in using the stop block, it was easy to repeat the cut for the other leg. The process for cutting the top and bottom stretchers was identical and left me with a finished template.
So I've just finished doing my little MDF mock-up and I noticed something. It looks a little bit small. So I grabbed my ruler and lo and behold, it is bang on 2 centimetres small. And I thought, well, that can't be right, surely. And it turns out it's not. Basically what I've done is cut the side rails too small. They are supposed to be 4 centimetres wide instead of 3. Mistakes happen. It doesn't change the angles. I know the angles all work out perfect, so the only thing that I've got to do is when I make it out of the poplar, make them a little bit wider.
Now I know what you're thinking. You're probably thinking, Niall, you said you were done with the template. Well, yes and no. There's one final thing, and that is to create a circular template that will make rounding out the top of the side table a breeze. I don't know what it is about cutting out circles that makes you feel like a proper woodworker, but it just does. Maybe it's because most things made out of wood are straight, and curves just make things look like there's another level of complication, when in reality there's not that much more to them. In fact, I'd rather cut something with a curve than try to get something square. And to be honest, that probably says a lot about me as a woodworker. I've only used this circle jig a handful of times, and by a handful of times I mean 2 times. But it's very straightforward to use, and actually pretty good. I got this one online from a shop called Rutland's in the UK, and it doesn't have any kind of measuring scale on the actual jig, so you have to mark it out onto the piece yourself and then measure up your router against that, which is no biggie. In fact, to be honest, I think I prefer this way as I trust my own measuring more than some cheap jig. After a little while, I finally had all of my MDF templates mocked up, and I was a little bit nervous to start this whole process again, but with Poplar this time, as the majority of the stuff that I've made has been used in MDF, cabinets, wardrobes, built-in furniture, that kind of thing. So even though this is somewhat familiar, used in real wood is a little bit different for me. Did have to be a little bit careful when rough cutting this timber, as it had a fair sized curve in it, and kickback on the table saw is enough to make anyone need to change their underpants. And I'm not talking about those little tiny kickbacks where the blade bites a bit, I mean those ones that rock the entire table saw. Thankfully I only felt a little bit of resistance, and that was shown in the form of some slight burning marks on the wood. But that's no biggie, as I still needed to mill up all the timber anyway. All woodworkers spend their entire lives dreaming about this exact moment. For some, unfortunately, it may never even come. I was lucky enough to find these offcuts from a previous project and reuse them in this project. Yes, you heard it here first, ladies and gentlemen. I actually reused my offcuts, and what a glorious feeling that moment was. Like cutting out circles, milling up wood gives you the same feeling of being a proper woodworker. I can only imagine it's because you're doing something that so many people cannot. And I know it's only because of a tool, but I'm sure in about 8 years and roughly 300 projects later, it will have paid for itself. So I think it was a pretty good financial decision if you ask me. No, but in all seriousness, if you want to find out a little bit more about this machine, then go check out my last video where I take a deep dive into all of its features. It was around about now that I remembered when milling up short pieces of timber, the likelihood of kickback on the planer is massively increased, and if you thought the outcome of a kickback on a table saw was nasty, then you may want to rethink your life choices when milling up short stock on this machine. So I did the sensible thing and grabbed the push block that came with the planer to get my pretty little fingers as far away from that blade as possible. Once I was done planing everything up, I could begin thicknessing it all down to the correct width. I did this all at the same time to make sure everything was as consistent as possible, and thanks to my new dust extractor, I didn't need to spend 30 minutes cleaning up the workshop after this session, which left me much more time for doom scrolling on Instagram instead. Remember that circle template I made earlier? Well, it's back. And its first job is to help me lay out the boards and make sure that I don't put any dominoes where I'll be cutting, because that'll definitely ruin the look of this piece. The domino gets a lot of hate for some reason, and I kind of get why, but if you have it, then why not make your life a little bit easier and use it like I'm doing here. The lamello, on the other hand, can be almost twice as expensive as the domino in some cases, but doesn't nearly get anywhere the same amount of hate, and that I don't really understand at all. Once all the dominoes were in place and the boards had a healthy amount of glue on them, and so did I to be fair, they needed to be clamped up together. The one thing that no one really tells you about when putting thinner workbenches up against the wall is that it makes gluing up wider things a pain. Take this for example, this is roughly 45-ish centimetres wide and my clamps are 60 centimetres, and I still have to do my glue up on the floor. I'll definitely have a freestanding workbench in the shop when I have enough room. I can't be the only one who prefers using double-sided tape over masking tape and CA glue. This double-sided tape is actually carpet tape, I believe, and it's so strong, to the point where I don't want to put as much on because I'll have trouble separating the pieces again in the future. I decided to forego the stage of woodworking that every woodworker seems to go through. Rather than buying a million different router bits that are crappy quality, I decided to invest in this 1/2" solid carbide compression bit from Rutland's. It does such an amazing job of flush trimming whatever you want, let me tell you. It's so sharp you have to be careful just holding it, so I can barely imagine what the wood must be thinking when it comes spinning at it at 6,000 RPM.
Now I've got all the pieces milled up to exactly the same size, we can get along with jointing them together so that these bases are stable. Then all we've got to do is cut some cheeky half laps and we're done.
I've never actually used this attachment for the Festool domino before, and I've had it for about 6 months, but anything that can help me do less marking and measuring is a win in my book. It's so simple to use. Once you've got one reference mark lined up with the centre line on the domino, you can go ahead and cut all the pieces without having to measure anything else. As long as all your pieces are the same width, that is. Turns out all those recent trips to the gym that I thought were making a big difference clearly weren't making as much of a difference as I thought. I do actually own a flat tooth blade that I purchased last time I cut half laps, and it worked really well, but I was just too lazy to change the blades on the table saw over. So that meant once I'd got done removing most of the waste material on the table saw, I then had to clean the rest up with a chisel, old fashioned style. I was actually trying not to puncture all the way through when drilling these holes so that I could come back from the other side with a forcing bit to recess the head of the bolt. This didn't actually go to plan, and 2 out of the 4 isn't actually too bad, especially as it didn't cause me any problems anyway. I never gave any thought to whether I'd be able to drill out the holes for the threaded inserts to accept the bolts from the drill press, as I just assumed I would be able to, but I was very close to running out of room on the drill press, which would have been very annoying, as not long ago I sold my drill guide for my handheld drill, as I never actually used it. I made sure to drill the holes for the bolts and the legs oversized so that it would allow room for any wood expansion, which I doubt there would be much, but still better to be safe than sorry. The table was built, but I still felt it was missing something. If in doubt, add a chamfer, so that's exactly what I did. More specifically, a small one to the top and a large one to the bottom. I can't lie, I was pleasantly surprised with the finish of the poplar, as you never really know quite what you're going to get. Sometimes it has wild colours and grain, but this time, thankfully, it worked out. One of the many reasons I've been putting this build off is because poplar is extremely hard to find a finish for. It's well known for staling poorly, and I'd spent many weeks ordering and trying different samples. That was until I stumbled upon this hard wax finish from Osmo. This particular finish is called Honey, and personally I love the colour it gives.
So there we go, all done. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, guys. It wasn't too complicated of a build. It's pretty straightforward, but that didn't stop me making some mistakes, as always. Either way, it is pretty much finished. It just needs another coat of oil, wax, and then it's done. If you enjoyed this build, leave a comment down below, like, subscribe, it helps us out, it all goes a long way. Stay tuned for more builds, there's plenty in the pipeline.